On this episode of The Unwritten Rule, it's just me. Yeah, that's right. There's no Jack Knowlton. There's no Kenny Van Doren this week. It is just going to be me. Kenny is currently without power, and Jack Knowlton is on vacation. Lazy, slacking off. But no, it's just me. So we're going to have a shorter episode this week. We're aware Charles Bass, of course, made it 5 top 100 commitments for Mizzou in the last week. If you go by Rivals rankings, just a continued crazy recruiting run for Mizzou football. We'll have more that and a lot more on Sunday. But for this episode, it's just going to be me doing a one-on-one interview with Drew King from PowerMizzou. Very good friend of the show, very constant guest. So we'll talk to him about what he's seeing on the basketball front so far, because we haven't done a basketball check-in in a while. So we'll have a good conversation with him. Just kind of get a gauge on what we're seeing from the basketball side of things. So stay tuned on Sunday for Charles Bass and more on the recruiting side for football. But until then, just going to be me this week. The Unwritten Rule starts right now.
Marcel, where are you going with that disc? You are not putting that on again. Marcel, okay, if you press that button, you are in very, very big trouble.
Attention. Everybody stop what you're doing. It's time for The Unwritten Rule, a Mizzou sports podcast brought to you by the Believe Network, alongside Payton Haverman and Kenny Van Doren. Here is your host, Jack Knowlton.
All right, and we're back here on The Unwritten Rule, joined by a very special guest. Drew King is back on the show. A very, very special guest, friend of the show. Drew, if for those that don't know, obviously writes about Mizzou basketball for PowerMizzou, does great work over there. Definitely go give it a read. But Drew, I gotta start you off with the hard-hitting question. Mm-hmm. How does it feel to have Demoy Hodge on the Spurs Summer League roster?
I'm so glad you asked, Peyton. I am over the moon excited that Demoy Hodge will be playing for the Spurs in Summer League. If you've been paying attention to some of the moves they've made this offseason, they brought in Chris Paul and Harrison Barnes. And to afford those two guys, they kind of had to just completely gut the back end of the bench. So there's a lot of spots open right now, and I think that Demoy Hodge is going to get the chance to compete for one of them, especially one of the two-way spots. So I'm excited to see what he can do for sure.
Definitely. And I mean, I guess while we're on the topic of Tigers in the Summer League, have you been able to watch Sean East amidst the Bronny James show in LA? How has he been doing over there, maybe?
So I haven't gotten to watch him play. I have been following the stats a little bit. So like I know he got the starting nod in their first game. I feel like that's a pretty good sign. They have one two-way spot open right now. And they brought in another guard whose name I'm struggling to remember, but he's from Xavier. It was Xavier's point guard. And so I think that he's kind of the only other guy that they signed to an Exhibit 10 deal, which is the one that they can convert into a two-way contract. So I feel like it's him and the other guard that are competing for that last two-way spots. And from what I've seen, Sean's been the more productive of the two so far. So I think that there's a lot to like about Sean that he's shown for sure.
Definitely. And I mean, I guess just pivoting back from Tigers in the Summer League now, just back to the actual Tigers. Summer practices are underway. I mean, you just had your observations from a practice just a couple of days ago on July 9th. And there were a couple of interesting details in there. But I just kind of, before getting into specifics, just kind of your just overview of what you've seen so far, maybe what you're hearing around the program, just kind of what are you expecting or looking at early on?
Yeah, good question. One of the things that I thought was really interesting was when I talked to Mark Mitchell after practice. And he didn't necessarily say it outright, but the kind of vibe I got was, at Duke, they kind of wanted to put me into a box, right, and fill a specific role. And Dennis Gates kind of wants me to break out of it. And that's kind of the feeling I get for a lot of players on this team, is that Dennis Gates wants to increase their confidence, let them play a little bit more free, you know, and it's a lot of guys like Tony Perkins and Marquez Warwick who, have played at one place for their whole career and want to try something different with their last season of college basketball. So I think that they're still figuring out what exactly that will look like. And I obviously didn't get to see everybody on the team, but that was kind of the gist that I got from watching that first practice, was just that they want players to be themselves in this offense, whatever that looks like.
Right. And I'm glad you started with Mark Mitchell, because I think obviously very well regarded transfer class. I believe Evan Maya has them in about the top 15 or so transfer classes in the nation. And I think Mark Mitchell was kind of the most hype of that group, because like you said, at Duke, maybe he was more in a box, but he was a starter for Duke. Like those types of players, obviously, when Mizzou can get a hold of them, especially after an O for conference season, that's a big deal. And you mentioned in your observations that he had an open look from deep, I believe it was, and instead of shooting it, he dribbled, and Dennis Gates got in his face and let him know that it was a travel, which obviously for the intensive purposes of the drill. But so it seems like they very much want, like you said, for him to feel comfortable shooting from deep again. Is that kind of like what you're seeing with a lot of the players in general, like you were mentioning with the confidence thing, or maybe with Mark Mitchell in particular? What are you expecting from him?
Yeah, it's definitely something that Dennis Gates got on a couple of players about. Like Marquez Warwick, he did the same thing where he passed up a shot, took a dribble, and Dennis Gates called the travel. The reason that Dennis got in Mark's face was because that was the second time it had happened during practice. So I think what that is he just wants them not to think about shooting and just shoot it, right? Because that's really what that is thinking like, oh, I don't have enough time to get the shot off. And so like in Warwick's case, like the very next play, he caught the ball on the wing, and Trent Burns is the one closing out on him, and he puts up a shot over Trent Burns. Now it didn't go in, but Dennis Gates told him, like, you have to shoot that every time. That's what I want. So I definitely think that that's something that they're going to try to do is increase the level of shooting with a lot of these guys, because the other thing is, Payton, like you look at the transfers they brought in, and I think Jacob Cruz is the only one who shot above like 31% from deep last year. So that's going to have to be a real point of emphasis for this group.
Right. And you mentioned that with the 3-point shooting, Cruz being the only proven like sharpshooter per se, like on that they brought in. But they did also bring back Caleb Grill, who obviously went healthy. They're hoping, I'm sure he can be kind of that go-to 3-point.
He looked healthy this week. He looked
did
healthy.
he?
Yeah.
So did he look good? That was going to be the question. I mean, how has he looked since he got the red shirt that granted him an extra year of eligibility?
Yeah, I think so. Obviously, I can't get into details, but Caleb Grill was the best shooter that I saw at practice that day. He was the one who had the most shots from deep. He was a guy that I thought was going to have a more significant offensive role last year, watching him in practice, because that's the kind of player he looks like during the summer. So I think now that he's fully healthy, I think that they still have high expectations for him. He was one of the first guys that they brought out of the transfer portal last year, and obviously the team could have really used him last season. So I think that they're still banking on Caleb Grill to play a pretty significant role this season.
And I mean, just kind of looking among the other returners, I mean, I know Ant Robinson was someone who his name kind of popped up a lot in your observations from the last practice. But there's also, I mean, Tamar Bates, at times it felt like him and East were playing 2-on-5 on the offensive end. He's back, obviously. I know you mentioned they kind of want him to be someone that can be relied on to stretch the floor a bit for them. I mean, who else are the Tigers maybe looking at to kind of step up and carry a bit of an offensive load?
Yeah, so I think Tamar is obviously a big win for them. I think that, the two transfer guards they brought in, Marquez Warwick and Tony Perkins, they're going to handle the ball a lot for them. Ant Robinson, I didn't necessarily see him make a ton of shots yesterday, but he was doing a good job of getting downhill. He's still a menace on the defensive side of the ball, so I think that we're still going to see him get into the rotation. And then I was pretty impressed with Marcus Allen as well. He was hitting his shots yesterday. Had a couple of really nice cuts. He's a really athletic guy, and obviously has the size to be a pretty imposing defender. So, and then also got to talk about Peyton Marshall, of course. Like, I think that he was hands down their best interior scorer that I saw. And so I won't be surprised if he finds his way into the rotation as well.
Right. And I mean, you mentioned two of the freshmen there, Allen and Marshall. Marshall is one who really, I feel like, has just kind of, particularly from fans on Twitter, I mean, just some of the clips of him are very, very enticing to make you think, oh, this could be a contributor from day one. So I know you mentioned in that article you felt like he was kind of the best finisher around the rim for Mizzou. I mean, but just looking at some of the other three freshmen, I mean, Boateng, Burns, T.O. Barrett. I mean, what have you seen from the freshmen so far in the summer?
Yeah, so Trent Burns had his moments yesterday. He's still really skinny. He's going to need to put on some weight to be able to play in the SEC, but I thought that he looked pretty good. Him and Rob Summers were playing one-on-one, warming up before practice, and he had some moves on Rob Summers. He got double teamed by Trey Gomillion and Josh Gray on one play and split it and finished at the rim. So I think that, he was advertised as a stretch five, but they've really been working with him on scoring inside. And then T.O. Barrett, I know that he hasn't gotten as much hype as maybe some of the other players in this class, but he looked pretty good as well. He's got the size to be able to play right away. I think for him, it's just going to be decision making and the intensity that he can bring on the defensive end. But yesterday, from what he showed yesterday, I think he'll be ready to play if and when his number is called. I don't know how much he'll get to this year with so many older players in front of him, but I thought that T.O. looked good. I didn't get my eyes on Honor Boateng, but obviously, like, he's the headliner in this class. So he's a guy that's really strong, has that college-ready size, and I think that obviously he's another guy who has a pretty good shot to earn some minutes in this rotation.
Yeah, I mean, that obviously that's got to be music to a lot of Mizzou fans' ears, especially after, the freshmen last year. I mean, they were all well rated, but it was tough. They looked like freshmen, I think is
right.
The best way to put it. But I mean, also back this year from last year is a guy that I feel like has kind of been lost in the shuffle a bit, and that's Aiden Shaw.
Yeah.
You mentioned he had a cast on during practice, and Shaw is an interesting one, I think, because a lot of people see the athletic ceiling with him to be a potential like great defender if he could really refine his game, but it just hasn't really clicked for him in his first 2 years. But Mizzou still obviously sees at least something in him because, I mean, he's back for his junior season now. So, I mean, have you heard maybe anything about what Mizzou is looking for, what he's been working on, and kind of just what the expectations are for him going into year 3?
Yeah, so not a ton, to be honest. I think kind of the focus for him right now is just getting healthy and getting his wrist healed.
Right.
But, kind of what I wrote in the article was like he was still very involved in practice. And I know that's something that Gates talks a lot about when guys are injured, like, oh, they're on the bench, they're coaching. Like I started to kind of understand what he meant there, because like Aiden Shaw was, throwing passes with his right hand whenever they needed a passer in a drill. He would run with the team if they had any kind of punishment, and was really cheering his teammates on, even though he couldn't participate in some of the drills. So I think that Aiden pretty clearly still wants to be here. Like you mentioned, like he's got a really high ceiling if he can reach his potential. The big question for me is like, can he add something to his offensive game that will make him a threat beyond just being a dunker, right? Can he make a shot from the elbow? Can he put the ball on the floor? Can he hit a corner three? I think that those are any of those three things will help him find his way to the floor more often, because we saw the strides that he made last year defensively and on the glass. The big question is just, can you be a threat on offense beyond just alley-oops?
No, yeah, I think that's kind of the frustration with a lot of people. Obviously, that was a big talking point, but we'll have to see going forward. I mean, obviously, Mizzou, I think, kind of after the previous year, striking out on a lot of their top targets in the portal and winding up with some less than stellar contributors like Jesus Carolero. I'm just going to throw that one in.
I was waiting for it.
Yeah, for my own just personal reasons. But this season though, I mean, it was much better portal haul for them. I mean, it felt like they got a lot more proven commodities this time around. Is there more excitement maybe this season around the coaching staff, or maybe just around the program in general with the transfer class they brought in, or what have you maybe heard about that?
That's a good question. So I'm actually going to flip the question on you, which is, had last season, had they made the tournament, right?
Right.
Would this offseason had gone any better for them, right? Like, would they have done better than a transfer class headlined by Mark Mitchell and Tony Perkins, right? Two all conference, or I think Tony Perkins is the all conference guy, and a starter from Duke. I kind of think that no, like that's probably as good as they were going to do in the transfer portal. Now, maybe if John Tonje was healthy and was productive, they would have kept him instead of taking Jacob Cruz. But I think that they did about as well as they could considering the situation. So, I think it's still kind of early to say flat out like, oh, this is going to be a tournament team. They're thinking about the Final Four, but I think they're definitely excited about the pieces they brought in for sure.
Definitely. I mean, obviously anything from compared to last year is likely to be a step up.
Right. Not a high bar.
I mean, yeah, it'd be really hard for them to look worse than last year, I think. But I mean, what do you think in your mind qualifies as a successful season for Mizzou? Is it just kind of middle of the road SEC, or is it you have to get back to the tournament, or just kind of what do you think what does success look like for Mizzou this season?
Yeah, I think that when you're at this level, playing in a conference as big as the SEC, the goal every season has to be to make the tournament, right? Like they're handing out at-large bids left and right. So, I think that the goal every year has to be like finish in the top half of the conference and find your way into the big dance somehow or another. Now, if they come up short of that, like I don't think it's a complete failure, right? It might be a little bit disappointing, but even with all the transfers they brought in, it's obviously like a pretty young team. They have 5 freshmen on the roster. So I think that it's going to be a little bit of a growing year for Mizzou, but I also I wouldn't put the tournament out of reach for them. I think that this is a team that if it hits its ceiling, can be playing in March next year.
Definitely. And I mean, you mentioned it's a young team. There's a lot. It's a huge freshman class, talented freshman class. I'm sure there's high expectations for them in the long run, but I mean, for this season, how do they what has to go right? Just maybe it's a player breaking out or something like that. What has to kind of go right for that success to happen?
Yeah, so I'm gonna go out on a ledge here. There's a possibility that Mizzou will not only be like back to league average on defense, but there's a possibility they're actually good on defense this year, right? Like I think that Mark Mitchell is going to be an all-conference defender. He's a guy who can legitimately guard every position on the floor. Um, they have real size at that center spot now with Josh Gray and Peyton Marshall. They're not going to get pushed around as much in the paint anymore. And then like you look at somebody like Tony Perkins, he's 6'4". You know, he hasn't always been the greatest defender in the world, but he's got the size to switch across a couple of positions and make life pretty difficult. Ant Robinson's going to be an elite defender. Caleb Grill was the team's best defender before he got injured last year, in my opinion. So I think that they have the pieces to be pretty sturdy on that end of the floor. So to me, the bigger questions are kind of like we talked about already, is the shooting, right? How much can they improve across the roster from deep to help space the floor? I think that they have a lot of guys that can get downhill this year, whereas they didn't have that many on last year's roster. So if they're able to space the floor and get guys going to the paint, I think that it could be a pretty good year for them.
Boy, I mean, if Mizzou goes from what they've been the last 2 years defensively to above average team, I think you might see a lot of people get real quiet in their criticisms of Dennis Gates. And I mean, you mentioned like all the potentially good defenders there. And I mean, Aiden Shaw, we mentioned earlier too.
Mm-hmm.
Marcus Allen, I know a lot of people have raved about his defense.
Yeah.
But I mean, also you mentioned there, like they have maybe for the first time under Dennis Gates, they have like a true, like prototypical five, and they have maybe two of them in Peyton Marshall and Josh Gray. I mean, you mentioned, you made it sound like you're pretty bullish on the defensive potential for that one, and you like what Peyton Marshall might be able to bring offensively. So that five tandem of Josh Gray and Peyton Marshall, I'm curious what your thoughts and maybe your expectations are for them.
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing for them is going to be staying out of foul trouble, right? Josh Gray, the past 2 seasons, has had a pretty decent block percentage, but he's also like committing more than 6 fouls per 40 minutes, something like that. I haven't looked at KenPom recently, but so I think that that's going to be the biggest thing for them is protecting the rim without fouling and being able to stay on the floor. But on top of that, I think that Mark Mitchell is going to have the ability to slide up to the 5 in some small ball lineups. And you might be able to see like a Jacob Cruz or Trent Pierce or an Aiden Shaw at that 4 spot with the rest of the guards on the lineup. And, you know, Mark Mitchell, he's not the biggest guy in the world. I think he's listed at like 6'9", 230, but he's strong, you know? So I think that he'll be able to hold his own against some of the bigs that they're going to see. And like I said, like he's going to be a all conference defender in my opinion. So I think that their ability to protect the paint this year is going to be much improved compared to Dennis Gates's first 2 seasons where, you know, like last year, like this is no slight to Connor Vanover or Jordan Butler, but like they were just thin and weren't able to keep their feet planted when the ball went inside. And then like with Kobe Brown, like he's only 6'8", you know, you can't coach height. So I think that this year with the guys they brought in, I think it's going to be a pretty significant difference.
Definitely. And I mean, I want to get your thoughts right now. I mean, if you had to pick right now the starting 5 and the first guy off the bench, what would your guess be?
That's a good question. So is it the starting 5 I expect to see or the starting 5 that I want to see?
I'm going to say want, because no matter what we say expect, there's a 0% chance Dennis Gates will match it on opening night. But I do want to know what you want.
And this is also like the team where the starting 5 matters the least. I feel like
True.
Like they're going to play everybody. So I think that the starting five that I would throw out there would probably be Tony Perkins at the point, just as somebody who can facilitate and has really good size. Um, I know there's a lot of debate about, among the wings, which wings should be out there. Me personally, I think that I would go Tamar Bates just off of what he showed last year. I think
Right.
that he's kind of earned the right to start. And then I would probably go Jacob Cruz at the 3 spot. I think that he's going to be one of their best floor spacers. I think he's got really good size for the position. And then I would go Mark Mitchell at the 4. I think that he's a lock to start this year. And then at least to start the season, I would probably go with Josh Gray at the 5 spot. But I won't be surprised if Peyton Marshall is starting by the end of the year. I think that Josh Gray knows what to expect at this level. So that's kind of why I would let him get on the court first just to start the year off, and kind of bring Peyton along a little slower before you throw him into the fire. But like I said, like Peyton's a really talented kid. I think that we'll see plenty of him this year.
Right. And I mean, like you said, I mean, his starting 5 probably doesn't matter much at all. I mean, depending on how Mizzou wants to play, they could obviously mix it up. I don't think mine would be much different from yours. I think I might. This may be more of what I expect than want, but I kind of expect Grill to maybe be in there instead of Cruz, and Cruz is the first. But again, like you mentioned, doesn't really. It doesn't matter as much for this team. Does that differ at all? You think from what you expect from the starting?
I think kind of like you said, they're really high on Caleb Grill even after the injury, so it wouldn't shock me at all to see him get the starting nod, even over Tamar Bates potentially. Like maybe they see Bates as a guy who could come off the bench as a 6th man. But yeah, I think that it won't be too different. I think that Perkins and Mitchell are probably like the 2 locks to start.
Right.
And then, everywhere else, they've got options. And it might be different night to night, realistically.
Definitely. No, I think we had that conversation on this show, and I think we kind of came to the same conclusion. It feels like Perkins and Mitchell are easy locks, but the rest of it could be, on any given night, could be completely different.
Yeah, it's crazy to think they have 18 on the roster for the 2nd year in a row.
Yeah.
Like, that's kind of crazy.
Mm-hmm. Well, Drew, that's about all the Mizzou questions I have. I'll let you do what we always do when you're on the show. Your expectations for the Spurs this season. What are you hoping to see? What are you expecting?
I am so excited about Chris Paul being there. I felt like that was the biggest hole on the roster all last season, was we just didn't have a starting point guard. The Jeremy Sohan point guard experience kind of flamed out pretty quick. And Trey Jones, I think, will be a really good backup, but he's not on the same caliber as some of the other starters in the league. So, and behind him, we had Devontae Graham. Like, he hasn't done anything in a while. So, although he did hit like one of the most important shots of the season, but regardless, like I think that we got a whole lot deeper this year. I think we got some veterans who know how to play, who know how to win. Chris Paul is like, just makes every team better wherever he goes. And I feel like he's going to be Victor Wembanyama's version of David Robinson, just kind of teaching him how to master pick and rolls, how to master, what it takes to lead a winning team. So that's kind of my expectation. I think that I don't want to put it too high, right? I don't think that they're going to be like a top 4 team, but if they could get to one of the play-in spots or one of the 7-8 seeds, I'd be really happy next year for sure.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, the play-in, Wembanyama, obviously we saw what it was last year with him, ceiling super high. So, Drew, thanks so much for taking the time. As always, you can find Drew King over at PowerMizzou. Go read his stuff over there. It's good stuff. But yeah, thanks, Drew. We'll be sure to have you on again before the season starts.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Payton.